Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness change everything. Sometimes one person's courage saves not just a life, but an entire way of life. The winter feast meant survival for Jarl Halvard's clan. When their strongest warrior Bjorn collapsed with fever the night before the celebration, everyone feared the worst. No one dared help him except Liv, a slave maiden who knew healing herbs. She tended to him through the cold night and prepared the feast alone. When Bjorn woke at dawn, he found the hall filled with warmth and the scent of her care. The Jarl asked who had saved both the warrior and their celebration. Bjorn took Liv's hand and called her his equal. What happens when the mightiest Viking champion falls for the gentlewoman who saved his life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants, and in the great hall of Jarl Halvard's stronghold, the scent of pine smoke and roasted meat still lingered from the night's preparations. Liv moved quietly between the long wooden tables, her bare feet making no sound on the worn stone floor. In her weathered hands she carried a small leather pouch, her most precious possession, though none who saw her would guess its value. The pouch had belonged to her mother, Astrid the Wise, a healer who had served 3 jarls before the raiders came. Inside lay dried mountain herbs that most had forgotten, winterleaf for fever, thornbark for infection, and moonblossom for pain that ran deeper than flesh. When the warriors had dragged Liv from her burning village 5 winters past, she had clutched this pouch to her chest, the only piece of her former life they had allowed her to keep. Now, as she gathered the wooden bowls and horn cups from the feast tables, Liv's thoughts drifted to the previous night. The memory of Bjorn's fevered face, slick with sweat in the candlelight, remained vivid in her mind. She had seen death before too many times, but something in the great warrior's labored breathing had stirred an old instinct within her. Her mother's voice echoed across the years. "A healer serves life, child, regardless of who asks or who forbids. Slave girl." The harsh voice cut through her reverie. Thane Eric, Halvard's younger brother, stood in the doorway with his usual sneer. His pale eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had never known genuine hardship. "The Jarl wants to see you." Liv tucked the pouch deeper into the folds of her rough woolen dress. Eric's gaze followed the movement, and his thin lips curved in what might have been amusement or contempt. In the 5 years since her capture, she had learned to read the subtle signs of danger in the faces of free men. Eric's expression carried both curiosity and something sharper suspicion. The great hall stretched before them like a cavern carved from living wood. Massive oak beams supported the high ceiling, and along the walls hung the shields and weapons of warriors who had died in glorious battle. Tapestries woven by skilled hands depicted the clan's victories over rival settlements, each thread a testament to Viking strength and cunning. But this morning, the hall felt different. Word of Bjorn's mysterious recovery had spread like wildfire through the settlement, and the usual morning bustle carried an undercurrent of whispered conversations and furtive glances. Jarl Halvard sat in his carved chair at the far end of the hall, his greying beard braided with silver rings that caught the light from the central fire. At 52, he remained a formidable presence, his broad shoulders still capable of wielding the great sword that hung at his side. His weathered hands rested on the armrests of his seat, and his deep-set eyes held the wisdom of a man who had led his people through countless winters and raids. Beside him stood Bjorn Ironsleep, and Liv's breath caught in her throat at the sight of him. Where the night before she had seen a man hovering at death's door, now stood the most feared warrior in 3 settlements. His massive frame filled his leather jerkin, and his dark hair fell in waves past his shoulders. The fever had broken so completely that no trace of illness remained in his bearing. His steel-grey eyes found hers across the hall, and for a moment the weight of unspoken gratitude passed between them. "Approach," Halvard commanded, his voice carrying the authority of absolute rule. Liv walked forward, her chin raised despite the trembling in her legs. Around the hall, thralls and free folk alike watched with interest. She had learned long ago that showing fear only invited cruelty, so she met the Jarl's gaze with quiet dignity. "My champion tells me you tended him through his illness," Halvard said, leaning forward in his chair. "He says you used skills none of my other servants possess." "I did what I could, Lord," Liv replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. Bjorn stepped forward, and when he spoke, his deep voice carried clearly through the hall. "She saved my life, Jarl. When others feared to enter my chamber, she came with healing herbs and gentle hands. She asked for nothing in return." A murmur rippled through the assembled people. It was unusual for a warrior of Bjorn's standing to speak so openly of a slave's kindness. Halvard's eyes narrowed as he studied Liv's face, searching for signs of deception or hidden motives. "What herbs did you use?" he asked. Liv's hand instinctively moved toward her hidden pouch. "Winterleaf for the fever, Lord. Thornbark to fight the poison in his blood. My mother taught me their uses before she died." "Your mother was a healer?" "Yes, Lord. Astrid of Birchwood. She served your cousin Jarl Magnus until the Danish raiders came." Recognition flickered in Halvard's eyes. He had heard tales of Astrid the Wise, whose skill with healing had been legendary throughout the northern settlements. The loss of her knowledge when the Danes burned Birchwood had been mourned by many. "Show me these herbs," Halvard commanded. Liv hesitated for only a moment before reaching into her dress and withdrawing the leather pouch. The worn hide was soft from years of handling, and the metal clasps had turned green with age. She opened it carefully, revealing the carefully organized bundles of dried plants within. Halvard descended from his seat and approached her, his heavy boots echoing on the stone floor. He peered into the pouch, then lifted a small bundle of greyish leaves to examine them more closely. "I have not seen Winterleaf in many seasons," he admitted. "The old knowledge fades as the elders pass to Valhalla." "My mother made me memorize every plant before her death," Liv said quietly. "She said healing was a sacred trust, not to be forgotten." Bjorn moved to stand beside his Jarl, his presence both protective and respectful. "She worked through the night, Lord. When I woke at dawn, the fever was gone, and she had prepared the morning meal alone. The entire feast was ready despite my illness." Halvard returned the herbs to the pouch and stepped back, his expression thoughtful. Around the hall, conversations had stopped entirely, as everyone strained to hear the exchange between the Jarl and the slave, who had accomplished what seemed impossible. "You interest me, girl," Halvard said finally. "A slave who possesses skills my own wise women lack. A thrall who risks herself for a master's warrior without thought of reward." He paused, stroking his braided beard. "Tell me, what would you ask of me if I were inclined to show gratitude?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the central fire. Liv felt the weight of every gaze in the hall upon her. This was a moment that could change everything or destroy her utterly if she chose her words poorly. "I ask only to serve, Lord," she said, though her heart hammered with desperate hope. "If my skills have value, let me use them to help others who suffer." A slow smile spread across Halvard's weathered features. "Spoken like your mother's daughter." He turned to address the hall, his voice rising to carry to every corner. "Let it be known that Liv of Birchwood is no longer a common thrall. She shall serve as healer to this hall, with the freedom to practice her craft as she sees fit." The announcement sent waves of surprise through the assembled people. To elevate a slave to such a position was nearly unheard of, especially one captured in a raid. But Halvard's word was law, and none would dare question his decision openly. Eric stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Brother, surely you cannot mean to—" "I mean exactly what I have said." Halvard cut him off, his tone brooking no argument. "The girl has proven her worth. Would you have me ignore such valuable skills out of pride? Bjorn's eyes met Liv's across the space between them, and she saw something there that made her pulse quicken. Respect, certainly, but also something deeper, a recognition that transcended the boundaries of master and slave, warrior and healer. "There is more," Halvard continued, raising his hand for silence. "The winter months grow long and dark, and sickness often comes with the snow. Liv will need proper quarters where she can prepare her medicines and tend the sick. Bjorn, you will see that suitable rooms are prepared for her use." The great warrior bowed his head respectfully. "It will be done, Jarl." As the morning progressed and the hall slowly returned to its normal rhythm, Liv found herself surrounded by curious faces and whispered questions. Some of the other thralls looked at her with mixture of envy and hope. If one slave could rise above her station, perhaps others might as well. The free folk regarded her with cautious respect, uncertain how to treat one who was neither slave nor free. But it was Bjorn's attention that both thrilled and terrified her. Throughout the day, she caught him watching her with an intensity that seemed to look past her humble clothes and scarred hands to something deeper within. When their paths crossed in the hall's corridors, he would nod respectfully, treating her with a courtesy usually reserved for guests of high standing. As evening approached and the great hall filled with the scent of roasted meat and fresh bread, Liv retreated to her new quarters, a small but private room near the hall's kitchens. For the first time in 5 years, she had a space that was truly her own, with a narrow bed, a wooden table for preparing medicines, and a small window that looked out over the fjord. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened her mother's pouch, letting the familiar scent of dried herbs fill the room. Each plant told a story of summer mornings in mountain meadows, of her mother's patient teachings, of a life that had been shattered but not entirely lost. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Bjorn standing in the corridor, his massive frame filling the doorway. In his hands, he carried a wooden crate filled with clay pots, metal tools, and other supplies a healer might need. "From the Jarl," he said simply, setting the crate inside her room, "and from me gratitude that can never be fully expressed." Their eyes met in the dim light of her chamber, and Liv felt something shift between them, a recognition of equals, despite the vast differences in their stations. When he spoke again, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "You saved more than my life last night, Liv of Birchwood. You saved my honor and the honor of my Jarl's feast. Such debts are not easily repaid." "I seek no repayment," she replied, though her voice trembled slightly at his nearness. "Life is precious, warrior or slave. My mother taught me that above all else." Bjorn nodded slowly, then did something that shocked her to her core. He bowed his head respectfully, as one would to an equal. "Then you are wiser than most who call themselves free." As he turned to leave, Liv found herself speaking before she could stop the words. "The fever. It was not natural. Someone meant you harm." Bjorn paused in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame. "I know," he said quietly, "and I suspect you know it too, or you would not have worked so hard through the night." When he was gone, Liv closed the door and leaned against it, her heart racing. She had suspected poison from the moment she saw his symptoms, but saying the words aloud made them real and dangerous. Someone in Halvard's hall wanted Bjorn dead, and now she had made herself part of that deadly game. But as she looked at her mother's healing pouch and the supplies Bjorn had brought, she felt something she had not experienced in 5 long years: purpose. She was no longer just a slave surviving each day. She was a healer again, with the power to preserve life and fight against those who would destroy it. Outside her window, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the settlement in a blanket of pristine white. Soon the fjord would freeze, trapping them all until spring's return. In the months ahead, she would need all her mother's wisdom, and perhaps more courage than she knew she possessed. The small flame of her oil lamp flickered in the draught from the window, casting dancing shadows on the walls. But it did not go out, and neither would she. 3 days after the feast, death came calling again. Liv woke before dawn to frantic pounding on her door. She pulled on her woolen cloak and opened it to find young Carrie, one of the kitchen thralls, her face streaked with tears and pale with terror. "Please, healer," Carrie gasped, clutching at Liv's sleeve. "It's my little brother Olaf. He burns with fever and speaks to spirits that aren't there." Liv grabbed her mother's pouch and followed Carrie through the twisting corridors to the servants' quarters. The small room reeked of sickness and fear. On a straw pallet lay a boy of perhaps 8 winters, his small body racked with chills despite the burning heat radiating from his skin. His eyes stared at nothing, and he whispered words in a language Liv didn't recognize. She knelt beside him and placed her hand on his forehead. The fever was intense, but something else troubled her more: the pattern of his symptoms, the way his pupils dilated, the strange, sweet smell on his breath. She had seen these signs before, in Bjorn's chamber just nights ago. "When did this begin?" she asked, already reaching for the winter leaf in her pouch. "This morning," Carrie sobbed. "He was fine when he helped serve the morning meal, but then he collapsed in the kitchens." Liv's hands stilled. The kitchens, where food was prepared for the entire hall, where someone with access could easily slip poison into a meal meant for a specific person. Her blood ran cold as understanding dawned. "Carrie, listen carefully," she said, keeping her voice steady despite her growing alarm. "Was your brother near the head table when he served? Did he handle any food meant specifically for the Jarl or his champions?" The girl's eyes widened with fresh terror. "Yes, he carried the special meat trencher to Lord Bjorn's place. But surely you don't think—" "I think your brother tasted something he shouldn't have," Liv said grimly. She began crushing winterleaf between her palms, releasing its bitter scent. "Help me lift his head." As they worked to force the healing brew past Olaf's cracked lips, Liv's mind raced. Someone was trying to kill Bjorn, and this innocent child had become an accidental victim. The poisoner had grown bolder, more desperate perhaps after their first attempt failed so completely. "Will he live?" Carrie whispered. "If the gods will it," Liv replied, though privately she feared for the boy. Children were more fragile than warriors, their small bodies less able to fight off such toxins. She would need stronger medicine than herbs alone. A commotion in the corridor outside interrupted her thoughts. Heavy footsteps and raised voices grew louder, and then the door burst open. Bjorn filled the doorway, his face dark with concern and something more dangerous suspicion. "I heard the boy fell ill after handling my food," he said without preamble. Liv met his gaze steadily. "Yes, the same poison that nearly killed you, I believe." Behind Bjorn appeared Jarl Halvard, his weathered face grim. "Poison?" His voice carried the cold fury of a leader whose authority had been challenged. "You're certain?" "As certain as I can be without knowing the exact substance," Liv replied. The symptoms matched too closely to be coincidence. Halvard stepped into the cramped room, his presence making the space feel even smaller. He looked down at the fevering boy, then at Liv's determined face. "Can you save him?" "I will try, Lord, but he needs more than herbs. I need to know what was used, how much, and how long ago." "Then you shall have whatever information can be found," Halvard declared. He turned to Bjorn. "Search the kitchens, question everyone who had access to the food, find me this snake who hides among my people." As Bjorn departed on his grim errand, Halvard remained, watching as Liv tended to the sick child. She worked with quiet efficiency, her hands gentle but sure, as she prepared poultices and brews from her dwindling supply of herbs. "You knew this wasn't natural illness," the Jarl observed. "Even before you saw the boy." Liv hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I suspected when I treated Bjorn. The fever was too specific, too targeted. Real sickness spreads differently. Yet you said nothing." "I had no proof, Lord. Only suspicion. To accuse without evidence would serve no one." Halvard nodded approvingly. "Wisdom beyond your years. Your mother trained you well in more than healing, it seems." They worked in tense silence as Olaf's condition worsened. Despite Liv's best efforts, the boy's breathing grew labored and his fever climbed higher. She knew with growing despair that her herbs alone might not be enough. The poison was winning. "Lord," she said finally, her voice heavy with reluctance, "there is one more thing I might try, but it requires something forbidden." Halvard's eyes sharpened. "Speak plainly." "Bloodletting. Not the crude method of battlefield surgeons, but the precise technique my mother learned from the old wise women. It might draw out enough poison to let his body fight back." The Jarl considered this. Bloodletting was viewed with suspicion by many, considered too close to the dark arts for comfort. But his people's lives hung in the balance. "Do it," he commanded. Liv withdrew a small curved blade from her pouch, another of her mother's tools, hidden all these years. The metal was old but sharp, inscribed with runes that most would mistake for mere decoration. With practiced precision, she made tiny cuts at specific points on Olaf's arms, allowing small amounts of dark blood to flow into a clay bowl. The change was almost immediate. The boy's breathing eased, and his fevered muttering grew quieter. Colour began returning to his pale cheeks, and when Liv placed her hand on his forehead, she felt the fever beginning to break. "Remarkable," Halvard breathed. "I have never seen such skill. My mother served 3 Jarls, Lord. She learned from the best healers in the northern lands." Bjorn returned as Olaf was taking his first peaceful sleep since the poisoning began. The big warrior's face was grim as he entered the small room. "Well?" Halvard demanded. "The cook remembers seeing Thane Eric near the food preparation area this morning," Bjorn reported. "He claimed to be ensuring the quality of your meal, Lord, but it struck several servants as unusual." Halvard's expression darkened dangerously. "My own brother. There's more," Bjorn continued reluctantly. "I found traces of a strange powder near where your trencher was prepared. The cook's assistant remembers Eric handling something small and wrapped in cloth. The implications hung heavy in the air. Eric's jealousy of Bjorn was well known, as was his resentment at being passed over for leadership roles in favor of warriors he considered beneath his noble birth. "Bring him to me," Halvard ordered, his voice deadly quiet. "Lord," Liv interjected softly, "if I may, the boy still needs watching through the night. The poison's effects may return if his body weakens." "Then watch him," Halvard said. "Your skills have proven invaluable twice now. I will not forget this debt." As the Jarl and his champion departed to confront the suspected traitor, Liv settled beside Olaf's pallet for a long vigil. Kari remained as well, unwilling to leave her brother's side. The 2 women took turns cooling his fevered brow and ensuring he continued to rest peacefully. Near midnight, Olaf's eyes finally opened with full awareness. "Sister?" he whispered weakly. Kari burst into tears of relief, gathering her little brother carefully in her arms. "You're safe now," she murmured. "The healer saved you." The boy turned his head to look at Liv, confusion clouding his young features. "I remember strange dreams," he said slowly, "and a bitter taste when I licked the sauce from Lord Bjorn's meat." "Rest now," Liv said gently. "The dreams are over." But even as she comforted the child, her mind was troubled. Eric's treachery endangered everyone in the hall. If he could attempt murder twice, he would surely try again. Next time he might succeed or more innocents might suffer. The small flame of her oil lamp flickered but held steady, casting warm light on the sleeping boy's peaceful face. Outside, winter wind howled around the hall's stone walls, but inside, life had triumphed over death once more. Yet Liv knew this was only the beginning. Eric would not forgive being exposed, and his hatred would only grow more dangerous. She had saved 2 lives, but in doing so, she had made herself a target in a deadly game she was only beginning to understand. The real battle was just starting. The confrontation with Eric came at dawn, and its echoes reached even Liv's small chamber. She had spent the night tending to Olaf, who continued to improve with each passing hour. The boy's recovery was remarkable, his young body proving more resilient than she had dared hope. By morning, he was sitting up and asking for porridge, much to his sister Carrie's tearful relief. The sound of shouting from the great hall interrupted their quiet celebration. Through her narrow window, Liv could see armed men gathering in the courtyard below. Something significant was happening, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a blade. A sharp knock at her door made her heart skip. When she opened it, she found one of Halvard's personal guards, his face grave with official business. "The Jarl commands your presence in the great hall," he announced. "You are to bring your healing implements and any knowledge of poisons." Liv gathered her mother's pouch and the curved blade, wrapping them carefully in a clean cloth. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked whatever was happening. She suspected her role in exposing the poisoner had made her a central figure in events far beyond her control. The great hall buzzed with angry voices when she entered. Every warrior, thrall, and free person in the settlement seemed to have gathered to witness whatever judgment was about to unfold. At the center of it all stood Eric, his hands bound behind his back, his usual arrogance replaced by desperate defiance. Halvard sat in his carved chair like a judge pronouncing doom. His weathered face showed no emotion, but his eyes burned with the fury of a leader betrayed by his own blood. Beside him stood Bjorn, his massive presence both protective and menacing. "Ah, our healer arrives," Halvard announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Liv of Birchwood, you have accused my brother of attempting murder through poison. Do you stand by this claim?" The weight of every gaze in the hall settled on her shoulders. Liv felt the familiar flutter of fear in her stomach, but she also felt something stronger, the certainty that came from knowledge and experience. "I stand by what I observed, Lord," she replied, her voice steady. The symptoms in both Bjorn and the boy Olaf were consistent with poisoning, not natural illness. Eric's pale eyes fixed on her with hatred so pure it seemed to burn. "The word of a slave against a thane of noble blood? This is what my brother's judgment has become. Your noble blood did not prevent you from skulking near the kitchens like a common cutthroat," Bjorn said coldly. "Nor did it stop you from nearly murdering an innocent child. You have no proof," Eric snarled. "Only the suspicions of a thrall who seeks to curry favor with her betters." Halvard raised his hand for silence. "Then let us examine the evidence more closely." He gestured to a wooden table near his chair, upon which lay several items wrapped in cloth. "Show the hall what was found, Bjorn." The great warrior moved to the table and unwrapped the first bundle, revealing a small clay vial stoppered with wax. Even from a distance, Liv could see dark residue staining the vessel's interior. "This was hidden in your chamber, brother," Halvard said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Hidden beneath loose floorboards where you thought none would look." Eric's face went pale, but his defiance remained intact. "Anyone could have placed that there. I am being made a convenient target for your champion's enemies." Bjorn unwrapped the second bundle, revealing a collection of dried plants that made Liv's blood run cold. She recognized some of them bitter herbs that could cause fever and delirium when properly prepared, but others were completely unknown to her, dark and twisted things that seemed to absorb the light around them. "Do you know these plants, healer?" Halvard asked. Liv approached the table carefully, studying the dried specimens without touching them. The familiar ones were common enough, found in any competent herbalist's collection. But the others troubled her deeply. "Some I recognize, Lord. Feverwort and bloodbane both can cause symptoms like those I treated, but these others," she pointed to the twisted blackened herbs, "I have never seen their like. They are not from our mountains." "Precisely," Halvard said grimly. "They came from traders who deal with the southern kingdoms, men who traffic in substances no honest healer would use. My brother paid gold for these, seeking knowledge of poisons that would leave no obvious trace. The revelation sent murmurs of shock through the assembled crowd. To use foreign poisons against one's own kinsman was considered particularly vile, a betrayal not just of personal bonds, but of Viking honor itself. Eric's composure finally cracked. "You cannot understand," he said desperately, his voice rising to near hysteria. "I am the rightful heir, the blood of our father. Yet you elevate a common warrior above your own brother. Give him honors that should be mine by birth." "Bjorn earned his place through courage and skill," Halvard replied, his tone as cold as winter ice. "You sought yours through treachery and murder." "I sought what was already mine," Eric shouted. "How long was I to stand aside while lesser men received the rewards of my birthright?" The admission hung in the air like a death knell. Even Eric seemed to realize he had sealed his own fate with his words. His shoulders sagged as the fight went out of him, replaced by the hollow despair of a man who had gambled everything and lost. Liv found herself studying Bjorn's face during this exchange. The great warrior showed no triumph at his enemy's exposure, only a deep sadness that seemed to surprise her. Here was a man who took no joy in another's downfall, even when that person had tried to kill him. "The evidence is clear," Halvard announced to the hall. "My brother stands convicted by his own words of attempted murder and betrayal of his clan. The penalty for such crimes is well known. Traditional Viking law demanded death for such treachery, usually by hanging or exposure to the elements. But Liv could see the conflict in Halvard's weathered features, the struggle between justice and the bonds of kinship. Eric seemed to sense his brother's inner turmoil. "Will you add kinslaying to your crimes, brother? Will you stain your hands with the blood of our father's son?" The question struck home. Halvard's jaw tightened, and for a moment Liv thought she saw genuine anguish in his eyes. To execute one's own brother, even for justified reasons, carried a spiritual weight that no leader bore lightly. "There is another way," Bjorn said quietly, stepping forward. "Exile. Let him leave our lands with only what he can carry, never to return on pain of death." Eric's head snapped up, hope flickering in his pale eyes. Exile was harsh punishment, particularly in the depths of winter, but it offered a chance at life that execution did not. Halvard considered this for long moments, the hall so quiet that the crackling of the central fire seemed thunderous. Finally, he spoke. "You will be gone by midday," he told Eric. "Take only your weapons and whatever supplies you can carry. If you are found on our lands after sunset, you will be killed on sight." Eric nodded frantically, clearly understanding he had been granted a mercy he didn't deserve. As the guards moved to escort him away, he turned back toward the hall with one final venomous look. His gaze found Liv among the crowd, and the naked hatred in his eyes made her blood freeze. She realized with growing dread that while Eric might be leaving, his desire for revenge would not die so easily. The immediate threat was ended, but a new and perhaps more dangerous one had just begun. In the weeks following Eric's exile, life in Halvard's hall settled into a new rhythm, but the undercurrents of change ran deeper than most realized. Liv found her status transformed in ways both welcome and challenging. No longer was she simply a healer, she had become something between advisor and protector, consulted on matters of health and safety throughout the settlement. People brought her not just their ailments, but their fears and suspicions as well. The bronze arm ring that now encircled her wrist served as a visible symbol of her elevated position. Halvard had presented it to her the day after Eric's departure, a piece of jewelry that marked her as a valued member of the household rather than mere property. The intricate knotwork design caught firelight beautifully, but more importantly, it granted her freedoms she had never dared imagine. She could now move freely throughout the settlement, gather herbs from the surrounding forests, and even trade with visiting merchants for supplies. The arm ring opened doors that had been barred to her for 5 long years, yet with each new freedom came new responsibilities that weighed heavily on her shoulders. "The Jarl wishes to see you," announced Ingrid, one of the kitchen women. interrupting Liv's morning preparations of healing draughts. "He awaits you in his private chamber." Liv carefully stoppered the clay vessel containing her latest batch of fever remedy and made her way through the hall's corridors. The private chamber lay behind the great hall, a space reserved for the Jarl's most sensitive discussions. She had never been summoned there before, and the significance was not lost on her. Halvard stood before a large wooden table covered with maps and documents, his weathered hands tracing routes along the coastline. When she entered, he looked up with the expression of a man carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. "Ah, Liv, come, look at this," he said, gesturing to the maps. "Tell me what you see." She approached the table cautiously. The maps showed the surrounding settlements, trade routes, and seasonal migration patterns of both animals and raiders. Red marks had been added in various locations, creating a pattern she didn't immediately understand. "I see our lands, Lord, and the territories of our allies and enemies." "Look closer at the red marks," Halvard instructed. "Each represents a report of unusual sickness in the past season. Fevers, madness, and deaths that skilled healers could not explain." A chill ran down Liv's spine as the implications became clear. The pattern wasn't random. It followed trade routes and areas where Eric might have traveled during his various trips to southern kingdoms. "You think he was practicing before he tried to kill Bjorn?" she said quietly. "I think my brother's treachery runs deeper than we imagined," Halvard replied grimly. "The southern traders he dealt with, they speak of a network of those who traffic in forbidden knowledge. Poisons, yes, but also darker arts." Liv studied the map more carefully, noting how the red marks clustered around settlements known for their wealth or strategic importance. He was preparing for something larger than simple revenge against Bjorn. Precisely. Eric always harbored ambitions beyond his abilities. I believe he intended to weaken rival clans through mysterious deaths, then position himself as a leader who could protect against such threats. The scope of the conspiracy staggered her. What she had witnessed was not just sibling rivalry gone wrong, but a calculated plan to destabilize the entire region. Eric's exile had stopped his immediate plans, but the knowledge he possessed hadn't died with his banishment. "Lord, if he shared this knowledge with others before his exile—" "That is exactly my fear," Halvard interrupted, "which is why I have a proposition for you, one that may not appeal to your newfound comfort." Liv waited, sensing that her life was about to change once again in ways she couldn't predict. "I want you to travel to the spring gathering at Thorwald's settlement. Ostensibly, you will be there to trade for rare herbs and share healing knowledge. In reality, you will watch and listen for signs of Eric's influence among the other clans." The request struck her like a physical blow. The spring gathering was still months away, but the implications were immediate. She would be leaving the safety of Halvard's protection to venture into potentially hostile territory, relying solely on her reputation as a healer for protection. "Lord, I am honored by your trust, but surely there are others better suited for such work." "There are warriors better suited for battle, and jarls better suited for politics," Halvard agreed. "But there is no one better suited for recognizing the signs of unnatural death. Your mother's knowledge lives in you, and that makes you uniquely valuable." Before she could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the chamber's narrow window, they could see Bjorn in the courtyard, training a group of young warriors in swordplay. His movements were fluid and powerful, each strike delivered with precision that spoke of years of deadly experience. "He worries about you," Halvard observed, following her gaze. "Since Eric's exile, he has taken upon himself to ensure your safety, perhaps more than duty requires." Liv felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had indeed noticed Bjorn's increased attention, the way he seemed to appear whenever she ventured far from the hall, the concerned glances he cast in her direction during meals. What had begun as gratitude for saving his life had evolved into something more complex. "A warrior and a healer," Halvard continued thoughtfully. In the old stories, such partnerships often proved stronger than armies. Lord, I am not sure what you suggest. I suggest nothing, he said with a slight smile. I merely observe. But consider this, if you accept my proposition about the spring gathering, you would not travel alone. Bjorn has already volunteered to escort you, along with a small guard. The offer both thrilled and terrified her. Months of travel with Bjorn would either strengthen whatever was growing between them or destroy it entirely under the pressure of constant proximity and shared danger. I need time to consider, she said finally. Of course, but do not take too long. Winter is the season for planning, and spring comes whether we are ready or not. As Liv left the private chamber, her mind churned with possibilities and fears. The bronze arm ring felt heavier on her wrist, a reminder that freedom and responsibility were often the same burden worn differently. She paused in the great hall to watch Bjorn through the windows. His training session had ended, and he was now speaking with individual warriors, offering corrections and encouragement with equal measure. There was a gentleness in his strength that appealed to her, a sense that power should be used to protect rather than dominate. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up toward the hall. Their eyes met across the distance, and he offered a small nod of acknowledgement. In that simple gesture, she saw understanding not just of the growing attraction between them, but of the choices they both faced in a world where duty and desire rarely aligned perfectly. The bronze arm ring caught the afternoon light as she raised her hand to return his greeting. Whatever decision she made about Halvard's proposition, she would not make it alone. For better or worse, her fate had become entangled with forces larger than herself. The real question was whether she had the courage to embrace that destiny. Winter's grip tightened on the settlement as the days grew shorter and the fjord began to freeze at its edges. The decision Halvard had asked Liv to make weighed heavily on her mind, but it was Bjorn's quiet presence that ultimately helped her find clarity. He had taken to visiting her chamber in the evenings, ostensibly to discuss security measures for her growing collection of rare herbs and medicines. But their conversations inevitably drifted to deeper matters, memories of lost families, dreams deferred by circumstance, and the strange turns of fate that had brought them together. "You're considering the Jarl's proposal," he observed one particularly cold evening, settling onto the wooden stool beside her work table. The stone runestone that hung from his neck caught the lamplight, an ancient piece, carved with protective runes that had belonged to his grandfather. Liv looked up from the healing draught she was preparing, noting the careful neutrality in his voice. "You think I should refuse?" "I think you should choose what serves your heart, not just your duty," he replied, his steel-grey eyes reflecting the small flame of her oil lamp. "There are other ways to serve Halvard's interests that don't require placing yourself in danger." She set down her mortar and pestle, giving him her full attention. "And what does your heart counsel, Bjorn Ironsleep?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was certain they should cross. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, carrying emotions he rarely allowed others to see. "My heart is selfish," he admitted. "It wants to keep you safe within these walls, where I can protect you from the enemies that Eric's exile has surely created. But my mind knows that your skills are too valuable to waste on such comfort." Liv reached across the small space between them and placed her hand over his. His skin was warm and calloused from years of weapon work, but his fingers were surprisingly gentle as they closed around hers. "Perhaps there is wisdom in following both heart and mind," she suggested softly. "The Jarl mentioned you had volunteered to escort me. I would follow you to the edge of the world if necessary," he said simply. "The question is whether you trust me to guard your back while you work your healing among strangers who may wish us both harm." Before she could answer, a sharp knock interrupted them. Bjorn's hand moved instinctively toward his sword hilt as Liv called for the visitor to enter. Young Kari burst through the door, her face flushed with cold and excitement. "Healer, please come quickly. There are travelers at the gates, injured traders from the southern routes. The guards say they bring news of strange happenings. Liv gathered her supplies while Bjorn checked his weapons. Together, they hurried through the hall's corridors toward the main gates, where a small group of merchants waited in the torchlit courtyard. The traders were a sorry sight, 3 men wrapped in thick furs, their faces drawn with exhaustion and pain. One leaned heavily on a makeshift crutch, his leg clearly broken and poorly set. Another bore fresh sword cuts across his arms, while the third showed signs of fever that made Liv's trained eye narrow with concern. "Bring them to the hall," she instructed the guards. "They need warmth and proper treatment before they can tell their tale." As they helped the injured men inside, the least wounded of the 3 began speaking in rapid, frightened bursts. "Blessed healer, we come from Grimwald's settlement 3 days south. Terrible things there, death that walks in darkness, sickness that drives men mad." Bjorn and Liv exchanged meaningful glances. Grimwald's territory was marked on Halvard's map with several red notations, and these men's arrival seemed to confirm their worst fears about Eric's spreading influence. "Rest first," Liv said firmly, guiding the fevering man to a bench near the fire. "Your tale will wait until your bodies are tended." She worked efficiently to clean wounds, set the broken bone properly, and prepared draughts to ease pain and fight infection. The man with fever concerned her most. His symptoms were unlike any natural illness she knew, and the strange, sweet scent on his breath reminded her uncomfortably of the poison Eric had used. As she tended to him, Bjorn questioned the other 2 traders about their journey. Their story emerged in fragments: whole families found dead in their beds with no marks of violence, livestock that sickened and died despite appearing healthy days before, and most disturbing of all, reports of a pale stranger who had been seen near each affected homestead. "This stranger," Bjorn pressed gently, "did any describe his appearance?" "Thin as a blade," the injured man replied, wincing as Liv wrapped his arm. "Light hair, light eyes, and a way of moving that seemed wrong somehow, like a wolf pretending to be a dog." Eric. The description matched perfectly, confirming that he had not simply vanished into exile, but had instead returned to continue his poisonous work among their neighbors. Halvard arrived as Liv was finishing her treatments, his weathered face dark with concern. He listened to the trader's account in grim silence, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed his strategic mind at work. "How many dead in Grimwald's settlement?" he inquired. "Perhaps 24, Lord, including Grimwald himself and his eldest son. The survivors speak of abandoning their homes come spring, seeking safety in larger settlements." The implications were staggering. If Eric could destabilize entire communities with his poisoning campaign, the spring gathering would indeed be crucial. Panicked refugees would carry their fears to other settlements, potentially sparking conflicts that could consume the entire region. "We cannot wait for spring," Halvard decided. "The threat moves faster than we anticipated." He turned to Liv and Bjorn with an expression that brooked no argument. "You will depart within the week. Winter travel is dangerous, but allowing Eric to continue his work unchecked would be far worse." Liv felt her stomach tighten with apprehension, but she also experienced an unexpected surge of determination. These people were suffering from evils she understood, poisons and diseases she might be able to counter. Her mother's knowledge could save lives that would otherwise be lost to Eric's twisted ambitions. "I accept," she said quietly, "but I will need more than herbs for this journey. If Eric is using foreign poisons, I must understand them well enough to create effective treatments." Halvard nodded approvingly. "Whatever you require shall be provided. Bjorn, select your most trusted warriors for the escort. No more than 6, you must travel light and fast." As they made final preparations that night, Bjorn returned to Liv's chamber one last time before departure. The stone runestone around his neck seemed heavier somehow, and she realized he was as nervous about their upcoming journey as she was. "Are you certain about this?" he asked, though they both knew the decision was already made. "Certainty is a luxury we cannot afford," she replied, carefully packing her mother's tools and the precious herbs that might mean the difference between life and death for Eric's future victims. But sometimes courage must serve in its place. He nodded and touched the runestone at his throat. A gesture she had learned was his way of seeking strength from ancestral wisdom. Outside, snow began falling more heavily, covering the settlement in pristine white that would soon be stained with the tracks of their departure. The safe, comfortable world she had known was ending, but perhaps something better awaited beyond the walls. The winter journey to Grimwald's abandoned settlement took 4 days through snow-laden forests and frozen streams. Liv rode between Bjorn and his second-in-command, Torsten, wrapped in furs that barely kept the bitter cold at bay. The silver pendant that now hung at her throat, a parting gift from Halvard, bore the Jarl's personal seal, marking her as his official representative with authority to speak for the clan. Their small group moved like ghosts through the white landscape, following deer paths and old trade routes that Eric might have used in his deadly campaign. Bjorn had chosen his companions well, experienced warriors who could fight if necessary, but understood that stealth and speed were their primary weapons. On the second night, as they sheltered in a cave that offered protection from the howling wind, Liv made a discovery that chilled her more than any winter storm. She had been examining tracks in the snow outside their shelter boot prints that seemed too fresh to belong to any ordinary traveler. The pattern was distinctive, a slight drag of the left foot that spoke of an old injury poorly healed. She had seen that gait before, during Eric's years in Halvard's hall. "He's following us," she told Bjorn quietly when she returned to the cave's warmth. The big warrior's expression darkened as she described the tracks. "How close?" "Perhaps half a day behind. The snow has covered most signs, but enough remains to be certain." Torsten, a grizzled veteran with scars across his face, spat into the fire. "Let him come. I've wanted a proper fight since we left home." "This is not about fighting," Bjorn said firmly. "Eric is dangerous precisely because he avoids direct confrontation. If he's following us, he has a plan that doesn't involve honorable combat." Liv touched the silver pendant at her throat, drawing comfort from its weight. "He knows I can counter his poisons. Perhaps he seeks to eliminate that threat before continuing his work." They spent a restless night taking turns at watch, but Eric made no move against them. When dawn broke grey and cold, his tracks had vanished entirely, either covered by fresh snow or deliberately obscured by someone who understood woodcraft better than they had credited him. By the third day, they reached the outskirts of what had been Grimwald's thriving settlement. The silence that greeted them was more unnerving than any battle cry. No smoke rose from chimneys, no voices carried on the wind, and even the birds seemed to have abandoned the area. The first house they examined told a story that made Liv's blood run cold. A family of 5 lay in their beds as if they had simply gone to sleep and never awakened. No signs of struggle, no obvious wounds, just the peaceful faces of death that had come quietly in the night. "The same sweet smell," she noted, kneeling beside the smallest victim, a girl perhaps 7 years old. Whatever poison Eric used, it killed without pain or terror. Bjorn stood in the doorway, his hand resting on his sword, hilt more from habit than expectation of danger. A mercy, perhaps, in such circumstances. "Mercy would have been leaving them alive," Liv replied grimly. She began collecting samples, traces of powder near cups, residue on eating utensils, anything that might help her understand the exact nature of Eric's weapon. They moved from house to house, documenting the scope of the tragedy. Each dwelling told the same story. Families struck down in the midst of ordinary life, their bodies preserved by the winter cold in perfect tableau of interrupted existence. In the Jarl's hall, a modest structure compared to Halvard's grand longhouse, they found evidence that some had suspected the truth before death claimed them. Scattered papers on Grimwald's desk spoke of strange visitors and unexplained illnesses. One fragment, written in a shaking hand, mentioned the Pale One who speaks of southern remedies. He presented himself as a healer, Liv realized with growing horror. These people welcomed him into their homes, trusted him with their lives. Torsten cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Begging your pardon, healer, but how do we know you won't suffer the same fate? If this Eric bastard could fool experienced folk like Grimwald—" "Because I know what to look for," Liv interrupted, though privately she wondered if her confidence was misplaced. "My mother taught me to recognize not just healing herbs, but their dangerous cousins as well." As they prepared to leave the dead settlement, Bjorn pulled her aside near the ruins of what had been a thriving smithy. His face bore the weight of terrible decision, and she sensed he was struggling with something that went beyond their immediate mission. "Liv, I must ask something of you that may seem like cowardice." She waited, studying the lines of worry that creased his weathered features. "If we encounter Eric directly, if he threatens you with violence rather than poison, I want you to promise me you will run. Do not try to heal, do not try to reason with him. Simply flee and let me handle whatever follows." The request struck her as both touching and frustrating. "You think I cannot defend myself? I think you have courage that exceeds wisdom," he replied gently. "The same courage that led you to save my life when others feared to try. But Eric fights with weapons you cannot counter through herbs and healing." Before she could respond, a shout from Torsten interrupted them. The scarred warrior stood at the settlement's edge, pointing toward the forest where fresh smoke rose in a thin column against the grey sky. "Someone else survived," Bjorn concluded, his hand moving to his sword. "Or someone has returned." They approached the smoke source cautiously, weapons ready but hoping for survivors rather than enemies. What they found was neither a small cooking fire tended by an old woman who seemed entirely unaffected by the tragedy that had claimed her community. "Grandmother," Liv called respectfully as they emerged from the tree line. "Are you well? Do you need assistance?" The old woman looked up with eyes that held too much knowledge and not enough sanity. When she smiled, gaps between her remaining teeth made her expression unsettling rather than welcoming. "Well enough, child. Though I wonder what brings a healer to a place where healing comes too late." Something in her tone made Liv's skin crawl. The silver pendant at her throat seemed to grow colder, and she found herself stepping closer to Bjorn's protective presence. "We seek information about the deaths here," Bjorn said carefully, "and about the stranger who may have caused them." The old woman's smile widened, becoming something predatory and knowing. "Oh, the Pale One left more than death behind. He left knowledge, promises of power for those wise enough to learn his lessons." The implications hit Liv like a physical blow. Eric hadn't just killed these people, he had recruited accomplices, spreading his poison knowledge like a disease that infected minds as well as bodies. Their mission had just become infinitely more complex and dangerous. The old woman's name was Helga, and the story she told by the flickering firelight changed everything Liv thought she understood about Eric's conspiracy. "Sit, children," Helga cackled, stirring something in a small iron pot that gave off an aroma both appetizing and unsettling. "Old bones need warmth, and truth needs proper preparation before it can be swallowed." Bjorn remained standing, his hand near his weapon, but Liv found herself drawn to sit across from the crone, despite every instinct screaming danger. There was knowledge in those rheumy eyes, terrible knowledge that might be crucial to stopping Eric's campaign. "You spoke of the Pale One teaching others," Liv said carefully. "What manner of lessons?" Helga's grin revealed far too much gum and far too few teeth. "Patience, healer. First, let me tell you about your mother." The words hit Liv like a blow to the chest. "My mother? How could you possibly? Astrid the Wise was not the saint you believe her to be," Helga continued, ladling the contents of her pot into a wooden bowl. "Oh, she was skilled beyond measure, I'll grant you that. But her knowledge came from sources your tender heart would find disturbing." Liv felt the world tilting around her. "You're lying. My mother was a healer, nothing more." "Your mother was a student of the old ways, all the old ways," Helga corrected. offering the bowl to Liv with hands that shook with more than age. The same forbidden arts that your precious Eric now employs. Where do you think he learned to blend death with such artistry? The silver pendant at Liv's throat seemed to burn against her skin as understanding began to dawn. The twisted herbs Eric had used, the precise knowledge of which combinations would cause fever without obvious poisoning, it had seemed impossibly sophisticated for a man who had never shown interest in healing. Astrid taught him, Liv whispered, the words feeling like poison on her tongue. Before you were born, child. When Eric was young and handsome and filled with ambition that matched his appetite for forbidden knowledge. Your mother was not always the wise woman of a single settlement once. She travelled far and wide, learning from sources that respectable healers would never acknowledge. Bjorn stepped closer, his protective instincts clearly warring with his need to understand this new threat. If this is true, why reveal it now? What do you gain by destroying her memories of her mother? Helga cackled again, the sound carrying too much genuine amusement to be entirely mad. Because the girl carries more than her mother's healing knowledge, warrior. She carries the antidote to everything Eric learned, knowledge that Astrid hid even from her beloved daughter. From beneath her ragged cloak, Helga withdrew an object that made Liv gasp with recognition. It was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age, wrapped in the same distinctive cord that had once secured her mother's herb-gathering pouch. Astrid's true journal, Helga explained, holding it just out of Liv's reach. Hidden here when she realized the full scope of Eric's ambitions. She came to me in secret, pregnant with you, and terrified of what she had unleashed upon the world. Liv's hands trembled as she reached for the journal. This is impossible. My mother died when the Danes raided our settlement. She had no time for secret journeys or hidden books. Your mother died protecting a lie, Helga said gently, finally placing the journal in Liv's shaking hands. They were paid to eliminate the one person who might counter Eric's growing power. The leather binding felt familiar beneath Liv's fingers, carrying the same scent of herbs and wisdom that had defined her childhood memories. But as she opened to the first page and saw her mother's careful script, the words she read shattered everything she had believed about her origins. My beloved daughter, the entry began. If you are reading this, then the shadows I have seen in the fire have come to pass, and the knowledge I hoped to keep buried has found the light. Eric Halvardsson possesses skills I taught him in foolish youth, when I believed wisdom could be shared without consequence. I have tried to undo what I created, but some evils, once released, cannot be easily contained. Liv's vision blurred with tears as she continued reading. Page after page revealed her mother's true history, not just a healer, but a seeker of forbidden knowledge who had traveled to the very edges of the known world in pursuit of power over life and death. She learned from the southern sorcerers, Helga explained as Liv read, from the wise women of the eastern steppes, from the death speakers of the far islands. All of it seeking the ultimate mastery over the balance between healing and harm. But the journal also contained something else, detailed descriptions of antidotes and countermeasures for every poison Eric had learned. Her mother had not just taught him deadly arts, she had prepared defenses against them, knowledge that could save every settlement he threatened. Why didn't she use this against him herself? Bjorn asked, reading over Liv's shoulder. Because using it would have required her to become the very thing she was trying to destroy, Helga replied. The antidotes require ingredients that can only be gathered through methods no true healer would employ. Your mother chose death rather than compromise her soul further. Liv closed the journal, her mind reeling with implications. Everything she had believed about her mother's pure dedication to healing was a lie, but so too was everything she had assumed about her own limitations in fighting Eric. The bronze serpent, she said suddenly, remembering a passage from the journal. There was mention of a bronze serpent that could neutralize his most potent mixtures. Helga's eyes gleamed with approval, hidden where she thought it would never be found. But first, child, You must decide what you are willing to become in order to save those Eric would destroy. The weight of choice settled on Liv's shoulders like a mantle of lead. To use her mother's hidden knowledge would mean embracing arts that bordered on the very corruption she fought against. But without it, how many more innocents would die while she clung to moral purity? "Where is this serpent?" she asked finally. "In the place where your mother first learned the dark arts, the ruined temple on Crow's Peak, 3 days' journey north. But beware, Eric knows of it too, and he has been seeking it since his exile began." Bjorn's hand fell on Liv's shoulder, offering comfort and strength in equal measure. "Whatever you decide, you won't face it alone." As they prepared to leave Helga's fire, the old woman called out one final warning. "Remember, child, your mother's greatest wisdom was not in what she taught Eric, but in what she chose to forget. Some knowledge is too dangerous for any mortal to possess completely." Riding away from the dead settlement, Liv clutched her mother's journal against her chest, feeling the weight of generations of forbidden wisdom pressing against her heart. The silver pendant at her throat seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, reminding her of duties that now extended far beyond simple healing. Behind them, smoke from Helga's fire continued to rise against the grey sky, a signal that would surely reach Eric's eyes if he was indeed following their trail. The race for Crow's Peak had begun, and the stakes were no longer just the lives of a few settlements. The very soul of healing itself hung in the balance, and Liv was no longer certain which side would claim victory when the final confrontation came. The bronze serpent waited somewhere ahead, holding secrets that could save or damn them all. And Eric, armed with her mother's teachings and his own twisted ambitions, was surely racing toward the same prize with equal desperation. Winter no longer seemed like their greatest enemy. The journey to Crow's Peak became a desperate race against time and Eric's growing influence over the winter landscape. For 2 days, Liv's party pushed their horses through snow that grew deeper with each mile, following ancient paths that her mother's journal described with unsettling precision. The weathered map tucked between the journal's pages had been drawn in her mother's careful hand, marking not just the route to the ruined temple, but also the locations of what Astrid called gathering points, places where the herbs needed for the most potent antidotes could be found, even in the depths of winter. "Stop here," Liv called, as they crested a ridge that overlooked a small valley. Below them, steam rose from what appeared to be a natural hot spring, around which grew vegetation that should have been dormant in the frozen season. Bjorn guided his horse alongside hers, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. "This matches your mother's map?" Liv consulted the journal, comparing the landmarks with Astrid's precise descriptions. "The crying spring," she read aloud. "Where the earth's tears keep life warm, even when the sky weeps ice. Here grows thornbane in its winter form, black roots that carry the power to neutralize shadow death." She had memorized enough of the journal to know that shadow death was Eric's most insidious creation, a poison that killed slowly over days, making victims appear to die of natural causes while actually destroying them from within. It was likely what had claimed most of Grimwald's people. "The risks?" Bjorn asked, studying the steam-shrouded valley with a warrior's eye for danger. "The plants are guarded by more than winter," Liv admitted, pointing to a passage in her mother's notes. "The hot springs draw predators seeking warmth, bears, wolves, and sometimes worse things that normal folk pretend don't exist." Torsten rode up to join their conference, his scarred face grim with concern. "Begging your pardon, but we've been followed since dawn. Single rider, keeping his distance but matching our pace exactly. Eric." The knowledge settled in Liv's stomach like a cold stone. He was no longer content to trail behind. He was positioning himself to strike when they were most vulnerable. "How close to the temple from here?" Bjorn asked, his hand unconsciously checking his weapon. "Half a day if we push hard," Liv replied, studying the map. "But we need what grows here. Without thornbane, the antidotes will be incomplete." The decision hung heavy between them. They could avoid the dangerous valley and reach Crow's Peak faster, but arriving without the proper ingredients would make their mother's journal useless. Or they could risk everything on gathering what they needed, knowing Eric would use their delay against them. We gather what we must, Bjorn decided, but we do it fast and with full watches. Eric may be clever with poisons, but he's still only one man against 6 warriors. They descended into the valley as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, the air growing warm and humid despite the snow-covered peaks surrounding them. The contrast was unsettling, like stepping from winter into some fever dream of false spring. Liv found the thornbane exactly where her mother's notes indicated, growing in twisted black spirals around the edges of the largest pool. The roots required careful harvesting, and she worked quickly while Bjorn's warriors formed a protective circle around the springs. As she dug, her mind wandered to the moral weight of what she was doing. Each root she harvested brought her deeper into her mother's forbidden world, further from the simple healing that had defined her understanding of herself. Yet with each piece of thornbane secured in her gathering pouch, she also felt the potential to save lives that Eric would otherwise claim. "Healer," called Sven, one of their sentries. "Something moves in the tree line." Liv looked up from her work, her hands black with soil and root juices. Through the steam rising from the hot springs, she could see shapes moving among the evergreens, too large to be men, too coordinated to be normal beasts. "Wolves," Bjorn said grimly, drawing his sword. "A large pack, and they're not afraid of our fires." But as the shapes emerged more clearly from the forest, Liv realized they faced something far worse than ordinary wolves. These creatures moved with purpose that spoke of intelligence beyond animal instinct, and their eyes held a pale light that was distinctly unnatural. "Eric has found allies," she breathed, remembering passages from her mother's journal about the things that dwelt in the deep woods, creatures that could be bargained with by those who possessed the right knowledge and ruthless enough intent. The pack numbered at least a dozen, each beast larger than any wolf she had ever seen. They spread out in a perfect hunting formation, cutting off every escape route from the valley, while their leader, a massive creature with scars across its muzzle, fixed its eerie gaze directly on Liv. "They want the healer specifically," Bjorn observed, raising his shield. "This isn't random predation." Liv's mind raced through her mother's warnings about the shadow wolves that served those who practiced the darker arts. Eric had not just learned to kill with poison, he had learned to command creatures that existed at the boundary between the natural world and something far more sinister. "Can you fight them?" she asked, stuffing the last of the thornbane into her gathering pouch. "We can try," Bjorn replied, though his tone suggested he understood the odds. "But conventional weapons may not be enough against beasts that serve a poisoner's will." One of his warriors, young Gunnar, pointed toward the valley's far end, where a figure had emerged from the tree line. Even at distance, Eric's pale hair and thin frame were unmistakable. He stood watching their predicament with what seemed like amused satisfaction, making no move to approach, while his summoned allies did the dangerous work. "He means to take us alive," Liv realized with growing horror. "Dead, we're no threat to his plans. But captured, we become tools he can use against Halvard." The largest wolf padded closer, its movements eerily silent despite its size. When it spoke, for speak it did. In a voice like grinding stone, the words chilled Liv's blood more than any winter wind. "The poisoner offers terms," it growled. "The female comes willingly, and the males live to carry word of her choice to their Jarl." Bjorn's response was to step protectively in front of Liv, his sword catching the last rays of sunlight filtering through the steam. The female answers to no poisoner or his pets. The wolf's lips pulled back in what might have been amusement, revealing fangs that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. "Then you choose the harder path. We are patient hunters, and winter nights are long." As the creatures began to circle closer, Liv felt a desperate idea forming in her mind. Her mother's journal contained more than antidotes. It also held protective rituals and wards that might work against unnatural beasts. The knowledge felt tainted simply by existing, but their situation offered few alternatives to moral compromise. "Give me a moment," she whispered to Bjorn, pulling out the journal and frantically searching for the relevant passages. "We may not have a moment to spare," he replied grimly, watching the wolves tighten their circle. But Liv found what she sought, a ritual of binding that could turn a summoner's own creatures against him, provided she was willing to pay the necessary price. The cost made her stomach clench with revulsion. She would need to offer something of herself to powers that her mother had warned against invoking except in the most desperate circumstances. Yet looking at Bjorn's determined face, at the loyal warriors prepared to die protecting her, at the evil that Eric represented to every innocent person in their homeland, she realized that desperation had arrived exactly as her mother had foreseen. "Trust me," she said softly, beginning to trace symbols in the muddy ground around the hot spring. "Always," Bjorn replied without hesitation, though she could see the concern in his steel-grey eyes. As Liv began the binding ritual, drawing on knowledge that felt like swallowing poison, she wondered if her mother had faced a similar choice in her final days, whether to embrace corruption in service of a greater good, or to die pure but ineffective. The wolves sensed the change immediately, their coordinated advance faltering as power older than their summoning began to build around the steaming springs. Eric's distant figure straightened with alarm, clearly recognizing that his careful plan was about to be turned against him. The real battle for Crow's Peak was beginning, and it would be fought with weapons that existed beyond the realm of honest steel and honorable combat. Liv only hoped her soul would survive what she was about to become. The binding ritual required blood, and Liv drew her mother's curved blade across her palm without hesitation. As crimson drops fell onto the symbols she had traced in the mud, power, ancient and terrible, began to stir around the hot springs. The shadow wolves felt it first, their coordinated advance, dissolving into confusion as the very magic that bound them to Eric's will began to turn against their summoner. The largest beast let out a howl that seemed to tear at reality itself, a sound of pain and betrayal that echoed off the valley walls. "What are you doing?" Bjorn asked urgently, watching in fascination and growing alarm as the strange symbols began to glow with pale fire. "Something my mother prayed I would never need to learn," Liv replied, through gritted teeth. The ritual was fighting her, demanding more blood, more commitment to powers that promised strength at the cost of innocence. Eric's distant figure was no longer standing casually. Even from across the valley, they could see his frantic gestures as he tried to maintain control over his summoned allies. But the binding ritual was stronger than his simple summoning. It reached back to the source of the wolves' unnatural existence and claimed dominion over them. One by one, the shadow wolves began to turn their pale, unnatural eyes toward their former master. The largest pack leader took a step in Eric's direction, then another, its movements no longer graceful, but driven by a compulsion it could not resist. "They're turning," Torsten breathed in amazement. By Thor's hammer, they're actually turning against him. But Liv could feel the true cost of the ritual beginning to take hold. With each moment that passed, each drop of blood that fell onto the glowing symbols, she felt something essential being drawn out of her, not just life force, but the very capacity for simple, honest healing that had defined her entire identity. The darkness her mother had tried so hard to keep buried was rising within her, offering power beyond imagination in exchange for the purity that had made her who she was. She understood now why Astrid had chosen death rather than embrace these arts fully. The price was nothing less than one's soul. "Liv." Bjorn's voice seemed to come from very far away, though he stood just beside her. "Your eyes." She looked up at him and saw her reflection in his steel-grey gaze. Her eyes, once warm brown like autumn leaves, now held flecks of the same pale fire that burned in the shadow wolves. The transformation was beginning, just as her mother's journal had warned it would. Eric's shouts of fury carried clearly across the valley as his own creatures began stalking toward him. But instead of fleeing, he reached into his cloak and withdrew something that made Liv's transformed vision sharpen with recognition: a bronze serpent, twisted into a spiral pattern that hurt to look at directly. "He found it first," she whispered in horror. "He already has what we came for." The bronze serpent in Eric's hands began to emit its own sickly light, and suddenly the shadow wolves stopped their advance. The artifact was more powerful than her binding ritual. It didn't just command unnatural creatures, it controlled the very forces that animated them. "Clever girl," Eric called across the valley, his voice carrying despite the distance. "Your mother taught you well, but not well enough. She always lacked the will to use her knowledge to its fullest potential." The wolves turned back toward Liv's group, but now their pale eyes held something worse than simple predatory hunger. They burned with the reflected malice of their master's will, amplified by the bronze serpent's power. Bjorn raised his sword, though they both knew it would be useless against creatures that existed partially outside the physical world. "Can you break his hold on them?" Liv studied the glowing symbols at her feet, feeling the dark power still flowing through her veins. There was more she could do: rituals that would give her strength to match Eric's artifact, but each step deeper into her mother's forbidden knowledge would cost her more of who she had been. "Yes," she said finally, "but not as the person you knew. Not as the healer who saved your life with gentle herbs and honest skill." The choice crystallized before her, like ice forming on still water. She could remain true to her original nature and watch Eric claim victory through superior corruption, or she could embrace the darkness fully and gain the power to stop him at the cost of becoming something not entirely different from what she fought against. Around them, the shadow wolves began to close their circle once more, their movements now coordinated by the bronze serpent's malevolent influence. Time was running out, and Eric's laughter carried clearly across the valley, the sound of a man who believed victory was inevitable. Liv looked at Bjorn's determined face, at the warriors prepared to die defending her, at the gathering darkness that would soon claim them all if she chose moral purity over pragmatic power. Her mother had chosen death rather than complete the transformation. But her mother hadn't had to watch innocent people suffer the consequences of that choice. The symbols at her feet pulsed with hungry light, waiting for her decision. Liv made her choice in the space between heartbeats, driven not by ambition or hatred, but by love. Love for the warriors who trusted her, for the innocent people Eric would kill if he escaped, for the simple right of children to grow old without poison in their blood. She pressed both hands into the glowing symbols, letting her blood flow freely onto the ancient markings. The pain was immediate and transformative, as if lightning were being drawn through her veins. But with the agony came power, raw, terrible, magnificent power that her mother had spent a lifetime trying to forget. "I accept the binding," she whispered to forces older than memory. "I pay the price willingly." The change was immediate. Her vision sharpened until she could see not just the physical world, but the spiritual currents that flowed beneath it. The shadow wolves were revealed as twisted fragments of natural spirits, bound by Eric's will through the bronze serpent's influence. But she could see deeper, to the source of their binding, to the weakness in Eric's control that arrogance had blinded him to. The bronze serpent was powerful, but it was still just an artifact. Eric wielded it through learned techniques rather than true understanding. He commanded the wolves, but did not truly know them, could not see the pain in their unnatural existence or the longing for release that burned in their stolen hearts. "Spirits of the hunt," she called, her voice carrying across the valley with authority that made the very air tremble. "I offer you what your current master cannot: an end to your suffering and a return to the forests you have lost." The wolves hesitated, torn between Eric's compulsion and her offer of freedom. She could feel their confusion, their desperate hunger not for flesh, but for the natural existence that had been torn from them. Eric's response was immediate and vicious. The bronze serpent flared with sickly light as he poured more power through it, trying to reassert complete control over his summoned pack. "They are mine," he screamed across the valley. "Bound by blood and bronze, sealed by ancient pacts that your mother never dared invoke." "Then let those pacts be tested," Liv replied, drawing on knowledge that felt like swallowing molten metal. From her mother's journal, she recalled the words of unbinding, a ritual so dangerous that Astrid had marked it with warnings in 3 languages. The symbols around the hot spring began to burn with white fire as Liv spoke the ancient syllables. Each word cost her something: precious memories of her mother's gentle touch, the simple joy she had once found in healing minor ailments, the innocent belief that good and evil could be easily distinguished. But with each sacrifice came power that dwarfed anything Eric could command through stolen artifacts. The bronze serpent was a tool made by mortal hands. What she was invoking predated human civilization entirely. The largest shadow wolf suddenly threw back its head and howled, not the hollow sound of unnatural creation, but something wild and joyous and free. One by one, the pack began to change, their pale eyes regaining depth and warmth as the bonds that held them to Eric's will dissolved. "Impossible," Eric snarled, backing toward the tree line as his summoned allies became something he could no longer control. "The serpent commands all spirits of the hunt." "The serpent commands enslaved spirits," Liv corrected, feeling the ritual's power reaching its peak. "But I offer them what you never could, their true nature restored." The transformation was beautiful and terrible to witness. The shadow wolves shed their unnatural form like old pelts, revealing the forest spirits they had been before Eric's corruption, beings of moonlight and wind that belonged to no mortal master. They turned to look at Eric with eyes that now burned with just anger rather than artificial hunger. Their former master stumbled backward, the bronze serpent clutched uselessly in his hands as his most powerful weapon became a powerless trinket. But the ritual was not finished. The forces Liv had invoked demanded completion, not just the freeing of enslaved spirits, but justice for the innocents Eric had murdered and protection against future corruption. "Choose," she called to Eric, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Face judgment for your crimes, or flee beyond the northern wastes where your poison can harm no more innocents." Eric's pale eyes blazed with hatred, but also with something that might have been fear. The bronze serpent in his hands was cracking, its power broken by the same forces that had freed his wolves. Without his summoned allies, without his most powerful artifact, he was just a man with knowledge that could be countered by one who understood it better. "This isn't over," he snarled, but he was already backing toward his horse, hidden in the tree line. "Your mother tried to stop me too, and look how that ended." The freed spirits of the hunt began to circle him, not to attack, but to ensure he understood the consequences of remaining. Their message was clear: leave now, or face the wrath of every creature he had enslaved and corrupted. Eric mounted his horse and spurred it toward the northern peaks, carrying his hatred into exile, but no longer possessing the tools to act upon it. The bronze serpent fell from his nerveless fingers as he rode, cracking completely as it struck the frozen ground. Spring came early to Halvard's settlement that year, as if the land itself was celebrating the end of Eric's poisonous influence. Liv stood at the window of her expanded chamber, no longer just a healer's room, but something approaching a scholar's study, watching the fjord's ice break apart under the warming sun. The bronze serpent's fragments lay on her work table, carefully arranged like puzzle pieces. Though broken, the artifact had taught her much about the nature of corruption and the prices paid for power. She had decided to study it not to rebuild its evil, but to better understand how such weapons could be countered in the future. Her reflection in the window glass showed the permanent changes her transformation had wrought. Her eyes still held flecks of pale fire, and her hair had gained streaks of silver despite her young years. She was no longer the simple healer who had saved Bjorn's life with honest herbs, but neither had she become the monster her mother had feared to become. Instead, she had found a middle path, using her enhanced abilities to heal in ways that ordinary knowledge could not achieve, while carefully guarding against the corruption that such power invited. It was a delicate balance that required constant vigilance, but it allowed her to serve her people more completely than ever before. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. When she called permission to enter, Bjorn stepped through the doorway carrying a wooden tray laden with the evening meal. This had become their custom, sharing food and conversation as the day's work ended, finding comfort in each other's company. After all, they had survived together. "The traders from Grimwald's new settlement brought news," he said, setting the tray on her small table. "3 families have returned to rebuild what Eric destroyed. They credit your antidotes for their courage to start again." Liv felt a warm satisfaction that had nothing to do with her enhanced abilities. The knowledge from her mother's journal had indeed proven invaluable, not just in defeating Eric, but in healing the damage he had caused. Settlements that had been abandoned in fear were slowly coming back to life as word spread that effective treatments existed for his poisons. "And the spring gathering?" she asked, pouring ale into wooden cups for them both. "Peaceful," Bjorn replied with a slight smile. "Without Eric's influence stirring up fears and suspicions, the clans have remembered they prefer trade to warfare. Halvard's leadership has never been stronger." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light of day paint the fjord in shades of gold and crimson. The simple domesticity of the moment felt precious after months of danger and transformation. Whatever power now flowed through Liv's veins, it had not diminished her appreciation for quiet human connection. "Do you ever regret it?" Bjorn asked suddenly, his steel-grey eyes reflecting the lamplight. "The choice you made at the hot springs?" Liv considered the question carefully. The powers she had gained came with constant temptation to use them for purposes beyond healing. Every day brought small moments when darker impulses whispered of easier solutions to problems, influences she could exert, wills she could bend, shortcuts that would serve expediency over ethics. "I regret the necessity," she said finally, "but not the choice itself. Eric would have continued killing innocents if I had chosen moral purity over practical action." Bjorn nodded, understanding etched in his weathered features. "Your mother would have been proud, not of the power you gained, but of the wisdom with which you use it." The bronze serpent's largest fragment caught the lamplight, its twisted surface reflecting distorted images. Liv had learned to read those reflections, seeing shadows of possible futures, paths where corruption triumphed or where healing prevailed, timelines that shifted based on choices not yet made. "There will be others," she said quietly. "Eric was not unique in his hunger for forbidden knowledge. Someone else will eventually seek the same dark arts he employed. And when they do, you'll be ready for them," Bjorn replied with quiet confidence. "Not as the innocent healer you once were, but as something more complete, one who understands both light and shadow." A year ago, such words would have terrified her. Now she found them oddly comforting. She had paid a price for power, but she had also gained the ability to protect those who could not protect themselves. Her mother's knowledge lived on not as a tool of corruption, but as a shield against it. As full darkness settled over the settlement, Liv carefully covered the bronze serpent's fragments with a cloth blessed by the settlement's priest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, messages from distant settlements seeking her aid, requests for training from younger healers, the constant work of maintaining the delicate balance between power and corruption. But tonight was for simple human warmth, for the companionship of someone who had seen her at her darkest moment and chosen to stand beside her anyway. Bjorn's presence reminded her of what she fought to preserve, not just life itself, but the connections that made life meaningful. Outside her window, the first stars of spring appeared in the darkening sky. Each point of light represented possibilities, futures where healing triumphed over poison, where wisdom overcame ambition, where love proved stronger than the hunger for power. Liv touched the silver pendant at her throat, feeling Halvard's trust in its weight, then reached across the table to take Bjorn's calloused hand in hers. Some stories ended with simple victory or defeat, but theirs had found something rarer, a conclusion that acknowledged both the costs of necessary choices and the hope that came from facing those costs with courage and companionship. The bronze serpent would remain broken, its evil neutralized. Eric would wander the northern wastes, his power spent and his knowledge contained, and in the warm light of a healer's chamber, two people who had found love in the midst of corruption would continue the quiet work of building a world worth protecting. It was enough. It was everything.